Numbers 23:19 tells us that God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? One of the ways God functions in our lives as believers is through the promise of God. As Christians, we need to learn to trust God's promise. If God says something, then that promise is certain. So if God says that something will happen, it's going to happen. Future events foretold by the power of God's word are just as real as past events which took place because of the power of God's word. The Bible is filled with examples of fulfilled promises which demonstrate the power of God's word over and over again. The Bible is full of God's promises to you as a believer, and when God makes a promise, you must trust God to fulfill it. Remember, faith is your response based on God's word. God spoke and the whole world came into being. That is ultimate power. We not only need to learn to trust God's promise, we also need to learn to trust God's power. Sometimes we look at the situations in our life and we don't see any answer. We don't see any way out. We say, God, can you possibly make a difference? There is nothing here for you to even work with. Well, guess what? God doesn't need anything to work with. That is part of what Hebrews 11:3 tells us. This is why creation is a supreme example of God's power, because in creation God made something from nothing. Look at the vastness of the universe which God created. Your problems in life may seem pretty big, but they are dwarfed by the size of the universe. If God can speak and cause the entire universe to come into being, God can take care of you as well. God does not need anything to work with because God can simply speak and cause that which is not to come into existence. Abraham in the Bible is a good example of the Lord promised Abraham a son, but there were two problems. Sarah was barren and Abraham was an old man. But Romans 4 tells us that Abraham believed in God who gives life to the dead and calls things that are not as though they were. When everything was hopeless, Abraham believed anyway, desiring to live not on the basis of what he saw he couldn't do, but what God said he would do. He didn't tiptoe around God's promise, asking cautiously skeptical questions. He plunged into the promise and came up strong, ready for God, sure that God would make good on what he had said. Romans 4:17 to 21. Let us look at some key phrases that just mentioned. Abraham believed in God who calls things that are not as though they were. Abraham's faith was not a blind faith based on his own hopes and wishes, but it was based on the promise and power of God. You can trust God's word even when you cannot see it. If God made the whole world out of nothing just by speaking, then trust God's word and speak the promises in faith, whether you can see it or not. Remember, the just shall live by faith. Be blessed.